Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Nyren. I'm the head of digital marketing and analytics at the MIT Press. And today we're speaking about tomorrow's economy with Per Aspen Stoknes. Hi, Per. How's it going today?
Oh, I'm absolutely thrilled to finally see the book out, and very happy to join you on this session, Hannah.
Great. And we're so happy to have you here with us today. So to start off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Well, right now, actually, I'm sitting in the Parliament of Norway. I've been called upon today because our party leader is sick, so I'm the deputy. But usually, I'm working at Norwegian Business School in Oslo, Norway, and my specialty is green economics, along with climate psychology. So I'm a psychologist by training, but I have a PhD in economics. But also, I don't like to be just an academic. So I'm also an entrepreneur. I've started up 3 or 4 green growth companies, healthy growth companies that solve both societal challenges also while making values. So I really like to be a real participant in the real economy as well, not just speak about it. So I go back and forth between these worlds.
That's amazing. That's such a broad range of interests and areas of expertise. I'm sure you have a very unique perspective.
Well, I hope so. Yeah. Go on.
So today we're talking about your book, Tomorrow's Economy. Can you give us a brief summary of what your book is about?
Sure. I think the opposition of either pro-growth, like more growth will solve all, or anti-growth, like more economic growth will crash our societies. It's quite unfortunate to have that polarization. So whether if it's like either growth or degrowth, if it's either capitalism or climate, we end up with a pretty crude debate. And it typically leaves those fighting for social justice or climate justice at odds with more mainstream or moderate growth proponents. Rather, we can nuance among different types of growth, whether it's fair or unfair growth, or gray or green growth, or suicidal growth, or healthy growth. So economic growth is far from just one thing. It's quite malleable, and we can restore it. And in the book, Tomorrow's Economy, I argue the case where we just now have this immense opportunity to create a different type of growth and solve that tension or polarization.
Great. So as you mentioned, as opposed to taking a stance for pro-growth or anti-growth, you propose that we pursue healthy growth. So how would you define healthy growth?
Healthy growth is quite simply defined in the book. So it's sufficiently greener or more resource productive each year, and it's also sufficiently more inclusive per year. So in a nutshell, healthy means green plus fairer. And these words may be quite general and somewhat fluffy to people, but in the book, I really dig into it. And so you have a quantified and precision when you're speaking about these issues. And this helps us because it makes this maybe vague or fuzzy growth concepts much more manageable. And also we can see who is part of the problem and who is part of the solution, who are making the necessary changes quickly enough, and who are the laggards. So we can get away from what we call greenwashing or even SDG washing or inclusiveness posing while not doing much real stuff.
Thank you. And, amongst other things, you're a psychologist. So how do you see the psychology of growth affecting people's approach to this subject?
So the first thing I ask in the book is, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the word growth? And I asked a lot of people about this, and some people think about the growth of their assets if they're investors, or if they are just plain humans, they think about personal growth, and others think about the growth of nature, so the growth of forests and the birth and rebirth cycles, and yet more think about growth in terms of whole evolution or ecosystems. So there's a diversity of growths, but when you're into the economic debate of planetary limits or overshoot and collapse, or the climate crisis, then suddenly economic growth kind of collapses into an either for or against it. And in this, I want to explore also archetypally, what are the fantasies and the deep emotions that bind people to certain types of growth. So, for instance, some people pressure a growth, prize a type of growth where everything gets bigger in a linear way. Everything should just go up and up and up and up and up. Others like when the limits are kind of keeping the growth in a bounded cyclical way. So that's more like a natural type of growth where things grow up in the spring and down again towards the roots in the autumn, and new seeds are made and the new sprouts come up. So ever returning growth, like there's nothing new under the sun type of growth. And finally, others think more in growth in terms of networks and complexity and emergence of new patterns. So how complex systems can grow their relations, their nodes, their inherent characteristics as they emerge from all that interaction in the whole. So all these are kind of muddled up when we get to economic growth. And this is where the book brings forward tools, practical tools to sort this out.
Great. And as you mentioned, you've also worked with some green businesses. You've been an entrepreneur. So how does this apply to businesses and business leaders? What can business leaders do to promote green growth?
Yeah. So thanks, Hannah. Maybe I can share a few slides and give like a 10-minute synopsis of the main argument.
Sure, go ahead.
So let me then just quickly share my screen here, and hopefully now you can all see the tomorrow's economy one slide. Yeah. So in my previous book that I published, was called What We Think About When We're Trying Not to Think About Global Warming, the psychology of climate action. I also made that into a TED Talk, which is now seen more than 3 million times, about the psychology of climate and sustainability. And this book that I'm launching today is called Tomorrow's Economy, and it really takes off from that TED Talk, because in it, I focused on the psychological barriers, what's keeping businesses and individuals back from moving on. And also what we've seen over the last 10 to 12 years is really a kind of apocalypse fatigue on this climate issue, as we've heard too much about doom and catastrophes and all the problems associated with very little on the solution side. So in the TED Talk, I presented this evidence-based model of the 5 main inner barriers to climate action. And I explained why many develop this kind of apocalypse fatigue from too much distancing, too much doom, the dissonance and denial, etc. I won't go into that in detail today, but all these defenses were particularly hard at work after the previous financial crisis, the Great Recession of 2009 and up to 2017. So this book takes us all a step further. What happened and what has happened after the TED Talk of 2017 and into the late 2010s. And the main event here has been, of course, the rise of what we call Fridays for Future, with, of course, headed by Greta Thunberg. And it came on top of maybe the worst climate news ever. In many ways, these were messages of despair and anger, and a pretty weak story, really, of how we, meaning humanity at large, or our economy, could solve it. Because the economy is at the heart of this challenge or this crisis. So all this came to a peak when Greta gave the talk to the UN And this statement, as he said, ecosystems are collapsing and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. Now, this exact statement goes to the core of this issue, and it's also a major challenge to anyone concerned with 21st century economics. So as a researcher on green economics, I keep being told by people that you cannot have eternal growth on a limited small planet. And this is a kind of self-evident truth to many. However, as a psychologist, I started to break up this a little bit to see what kind of growth are we speaking about and what do we mean with eternal and how exactly do we understand the limits of this planet. So where are we now at this moment in 2021 as we enter the 2020s? Are these arguments still valid or how can we deal with them? So let's take a short step back and see our current situation from the larger picture of the previous centuries. Because the whole industrial revolution got started in the 1700s with steam engines driven by coal and weaving and spinning machines. The whole textile industry got the market going in a new way completely during the 1700s. And then in the 1800s came another innovation revolution building on top of that. And now all the produced merchandise could be moved quickly on either rails or even steam ships. And all this came from the innovations of steel. And this was the time of the robber barons. This was when Rockefellers and the Carnegies and JP Morgan, etc., built their vast fortunes riding this wave. Then in the early 1900s came the next mass production revolution, building on the assembly line. This was Henry Ford with the T-Forge, and also building on new chemistry and chemicals. And then after the Second World War came the transistor, and we had yet another wave of globalization, electronic communication, TVs, and computers with IBM rising. And then on top of this, in the 1990s started the internet boom, which we all are, of course, are very much aware of today. And today, the biggest 5 companies in the world by market cap are like Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Tencent, etc. Now, at this point, we're seeing an increasing shift. We're starting on a 6th wave of innovations, now no longer focusing on labor productivity, because all the 5 previous ones, they replaced humans with machines, so there could be more value creation per hour worked. That was the main idea. And then they would throw the resources at the problem to replace people driven by fossil energy. Now, however, there's a new type of innovation coming focused on resource productivity. Resource productivity means getting more value creation for each unit of resource you use. So this is being driven by renewable energy and also by circular material flows to eliminate the extreme wastefulness that was part of the first 5 waves, the wastefulness of resources and the wastefulness of biomass and ecosystems. So let us define green growth then at this point, because it's important to have this clearly when we speak about these large issues. So there's an increase of economic activities that give a lower environmental impact. So the dollars could go up, while the tons of materials go rapid enough down. That's the definition of green growth. While we need to contrast this with gray growth, which is a productivity increase where total environmental impact, the footprint of a company or a product or a city, goes up in spite of higher efficiency. So we can then measure these things and get it straight from their account, whether it's a truly green growth, in which case the resource productivity, which is the improvement of the resource use per unit of value added, goes more quickly up than the rate of growth. While in gray growth, we have a resource productivity which lags. It's smaller than the rate of growth. Another way to illustrate the same situation is to use the green growth compass that I present in the book. Now, on the vertical axis, there is the value creation, whether we are making more or less profits, whether a company, a city, or a country. But on the horizontal axis, it's the ecological footprint. So are we having a larger footprint on nature? And if we have a larger economy with a larger footprint, that's the definition of gray growth. Well, what we need is a rapid green growth where we have more value creation, but much less footprint. In the last 50 years, we've seen mainly this red line, and now is the chance to shift from that red line towards the white line. And so what many like Greta Thunberg and other deep greens are fully correcting is the impossibility of a further gray growth for a very long time. That kind of growth that just increases the footprint. So you may ask, why should this conventional direction of the growth change sharply just right now? And that is why we have to look at the current both business and structural drivers that are happening right now. And there are two main ones. One we could call the stick, and the other is the carrot. So let's do the stick. And for instance, then we see mainstream investors such as BlackRock, the biggest investment fund in the world. Now they're increasingly both requiring and distinguishing in their investments among those companies that have a high climate risk and those who have a low climate risk. And they're avoiding the climate risk because they see it's a financial investment risk. So if CEOs cannot report on the climate risk, then investment will be taken away or in another way, or another direction. Going from the stick to the carrot, what we see is that over the last years, investments in sustainable companies have become more and more outcompeting the gray companies. So if you, for instance, in this study, invested in the shares that had a high environment, social, and governance rating, which is the ESG. If you had an AAA, then just 6 years later, you would have 50 more profits from your investments than if you invested in low sustainability companies, such that got the grading of B or CCC. Now, this is just one study. There are now more than 2,200 such studies. And in one review, academic review of this, all the businesses, all the investment decisions businesses do, then 63%, a large majority, almost 2/3, say that sustainable companies are more profitable than the conventional ones. You can also find studies that say if you put your money in sustainable companies, you're going to lose, or the ESG, 8% only. So very much less of those studies show that sustainability is unprofitable. While 1/3 says it really depends on how you weight the E versus the S versus the G, or the environment versus the social dimensions of sustainability. This was up to 2016, but in the recent few years, we've seen a marked pickup. Just in the last 2 years, if you put your money in green growth companies, they even outcompete the Nasdaq, the big tech companies from the fifth wave. So these are companies such as Tesla, Ørsted, Vestas, QuantumScape, Beyond Meat, SolarEdge, etc. And huge outperformance of these green growth shares over the conventional, what's sometimes called the value shares. Also, we can see how investment funds into both stocks and bonds, usually it was only like 1% of the flow of investment funds, but now it's more than 24%. So it's like a 10 to 20 times higher than it used to be just a couple of years ago. This might be a wave, you may say, maybe it crashes tomorrow, but in the book, Tomorrow's Economy, I argue why this is not the case. And let me mention 7 of these deep drivers that will be lifting these, ushering on this tsunami of the green waves. The first is that renewables are now falling in cost so quickly that they are every year outcompeting more of the fossils and other types of destructive energy forms. These are, of course, solar, wind, and batteries. Then, second, for about 5 to 10 years ago, investors would have a look maybe at the sustainability report, the CSR, and they would frown and throw it in the bin. But now, big data analytics and everybody is trying to understand what are the ESG factors that really make a difference for investors. So ESG is suddenly for real. And also we see material flows increasingly being digitalized with the help of sensors and also becoming more circular. So we get real-time material flow accounts, just in the same way as we have real-time money accounts. Fourth, financial climate risk. I said even BlackRock is now into that area, and they're absolutely a mainstream player. And fifth, I mean, we've been speaking about sustainability for 30 years, but little happened the first 25 years. Now, however, we're in a situation where humanity has, for the first time, a common plan of where we want to be by 2030. And these SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement are causing a lot of minor players to kind of pick up, but also major players. So it's a huge momentum once we have this shared plan. We never had that before. G3 is what I call the three biggest economies of the world. That is USA, China, and the EU, and all now have green deals coming or being implemented with net zero goals and more circular action plans. This also includes the EU so-called taxonomy, which helps distinguish between the type of investments that are for real and those that are not part of the solution. And finally, and seventh, we're in the midst of the COVID crisis, or towards the end, hopefully, which has really resurrected the active government. Because since Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s, we had this idea that government should be minimalist and not do anything and don't interfere with the market. But now we have this obvious need for a more active, entrepreneurial government, which also makes the economy and the market secure by making sure we get vaccines to everyone. And we need the stimulus packages, both the stimulus bill and also the climate plan, which is coming. So when these 7 things together make this an unstoppable momentum. And in addition to the green wave, we also need an inclusive wave. And happily, the stimulus bill does part of this. So in addition to the green growth compass, we also need the healthy growth or the fair growth compass. So if the economy goes up or down, we should still go towards less inequality rather than more inequality. So the shift from unfair growth to fair growth, which is equally important. So to sum up, our problem isn't really growth as such. It's the incredible resource wastefulness that we see in the linear flows shaped by the first 5 innovation waves. So resources were essentially for free. They were underpriced relative to the cost they incurred. Second, this shift in innovation, that's the key for the new type of growth that we're seeing, a shift from labor productivity to resource productivity. Investments in innovation will flow into this and help us change the direction of growth. Third, this would maybe happen too slowly if it was unprofitable and only was driven by government. But now we have businesses recognizing, and not least investors, that green is the new black. You're either losing out or you're part of that accumulating wave. And this 6th wave is a deep accelerating shift, even though the exact timing is unknown. We don't know when the peak of the wave will hit and when there will be a crash, which I think there will be. But after the crash, there will be a kind of a synergy among those who survive the crash and then move towards maturity. So that's the excitement of the 2020s. And this is how tomorrow's economy is being shaped over the next few years. So it's a very good time to be a business leader if you're able to capture the opportunities that are now increasingly becoming available through these 7 drivers. So that was how I see the big shift, Hannah.
Great, thank you. That was a great talk. You know, I love those slides, especially the Greta Thunberg slide. So you mentioned in your presentation a little bit about what governments can do and what governments are doing, but specifically, what government practices need to change to get the world on track for healthy green growth?
Yeah, that's a great and a very important question, Hannah, and I dedicate a full chapter in my book to the new roles of government. So you see, particularly in Anglophone countries such as USA or UK and also Australia, there's been a long-term decline in trust of government. It was very high in the 1960s, even 70s, and then 80s and 90s. There's been a steady decline all the way now until very few people in the US have any trust in government. Part of that has been a mental framing where you either have private freedom or you have government which strangles the private freedom. So like a tug of war, really. If one wins, the other loses. Now, that idea that the government is something that takes away your freedom, and the more taxes the government gets, the less space there is for private initiative, that's a deeply destructive idea and a misunderstanding of what government is about. So I propose new images for government, which is growing out of like the COVID situation. If you want a healthy market, it's like being in northern Norway with the snow and you have a hand, but there's no glove. So like hand in glove, the glove is the government, and that shapes and protects and helps the market. So it would freeze if you didn't have a market, or maybe like a fruit or a muscle to its skin. The fruit skin flesh is dependent on the fruit skin to keep growing in a safe and protected manner. So there are three types of new metaphors that should replace this idea of a tug of war. And the first is that government is more an entrepreneur than somebody who controls and destroys something. So like the US had this famous moonshot mission where we said, we are going to the moon before the end of the decade. That set off a fantastic growth of technology and markets and innovation. And in the same way, with a mission-oriented government that sets the goal and then provides the market players with what they need to get there, you will have a clear direction and a huge dynamic. So companies will thrive, there will be more jobs, and you will have a very dynamic market when it has a clear direction and is shaped by this mission. And yeah, and then second, government need to provide stimulus for the new type of products made. So not just entrepreneurial, but also stimulating. So by providing funds to the poorest or giving unemployed higher unemployment benefits, then they are able to come back into the economy and participate. But also stimulus in using the immense purchasing power by the government, so that when government, which is the biggest buyer in the economy, buys something, they will buy innovative and resource productive and green stuff rather than buying wasteful stuff, which governments have been doing for a long time. So using the power of stimulus and the purchasing role and to kind of bring up the demand side, that matches the supply side, where you stimulate from being an entrepreneur. So you say, this is what we need of new products, and then this is the resources with which we will buy it. And finally, we need to think of individual freedom in a new way, as the government as guarding our commons. So if I want to go a walk in nature, or I don't want to be trespassing, I want to have access. If I need a kind of cultural, a good city or internet commons, knowledge commons, they should be available to all. And companies would prefer to have exclusive rights to all this, but that makes you less free. So rather than kind of squashing the individual freedom, government should open up and protect the commons so that we have our freedom of access to these commons. And that's why I call the government also a guardian. So in summary, what we need is new images of government being a stimulating entrepreneurial guardian. And that's what I promote in the book of government's new role.
Amazing. That's so much information. I feel like I should be taking notes, but we're going to get into the Q&A soon. So if anyone has a question, the directions are in the chat. But before we get into the Q&A, I do have one more question for you, Per. So, you know, one really interesting point that you address in Tomorrow's Economy is that individuals can choose to prioritize sustainability by, quote unquote, voting with their wallets. So what do you mean by that, and how can this be done?
Sure. And it's a major question going back to the climate strikes and the frustration we all have when we see the climate crisis and the breakdown of ecosystems and wildfires and all those terrible things. What can I do? And unfortunately, it doesn't really help to give people a list of 10 things. Here's the 10 top things you can do, because we're all busy people. And we're all kind of already performing. We're watching the kids and doing Zoom calls and trying to fix dinner and make our job boss happy at the same time. So getting that 10 things you can do on top feels just too much. So we need to kind of think of this in more like from an inside out way. And in the book, I invite everybody to imagine that they have 4 main roles within which we have a portfolio of opportunities and possibilities to take action. And the first of this is the one you mentioned, Hannah, the one that you can vote with your wallet. So even if your wallet is empty, you can still vote, for instance, in the market by asking a shop or some kind of supplier, or even on the website, what is the footprint of this product, this shoe, or this, where did this cabbage grow? Is it part of regenerative agriculture, or is it part of like pesticides and fertilizer overuse production? So the power you have as a consumer is really to pose demands on the producer, because as I show in the book, research shows that the CEOs really do listen to what the market says, both the request for information, but in particularly where the money flows. So follow the money if you want to influence the businesses, and let your purchases follow your heart. So your heart's concern could kind of find a place in the type of things you buy, where you let your money flow. So that's the first, voting with your wallet. The second is, we all have some kind of job or work, or even if we are an employer or an employee, we're part of an organization. And as part of an organization, I can influence my team, my colleagues, my bosses, maybe make new projects or find new ways of doing accounting. So how can I raise this issue higher and higher in my organization? If I am a student, how can I influence my university? Wherever I am, I have this opportunity to influence through my professional role. And also, again, I show in the book that after consumer behavior, the second most influential factor in CEOs is engaged employees. So they really care if their employees want action on this. Third, we all own something, so we're owners. I may have an apartment, or I may have a car, or at least some clothes, or some maybe have some assets or some funds, savings somewhere. And whatever I own, I should try to shift that gradually towards being greener. So maybe I should, if I have a pension scheme, I should call my pension brokers to see, are they investing in the ESG? How much? Are they considering the EU taxonomy, which will influence the future value of these things? Are they considering climate risk? And just asking your bank, your broker, whatever, the pension fund managers, we should really push them all the time to keep moving our money towards a greener way. Or keep also maybe reinvesting in a house, getting a solar panel, rather than traveling for a large vacation. So if we can turn whatever funds we have and our savings that way, it really makes a difference. So that's the third. The fourth is, of course, our role as citizens. And that's maybe the most important role we have, because whatever I own, or whatever, if I have a job or not, I'm still a citizen. And the most important things we can do is to vote for those politicians that actually say and do care for a healthy type of development, healthy environment, healthy societies, less inequality, cleaner environment. And of course, this comes along with organizing, so participating in any kind of citizens groups, anything from climate citizens lobby, helping to push the cap and dividend initiatives, or just participating in town hall meetings, or calling your representatives, writing a letter, whatever, writing about it on Facebook. There are so many things we can do as citizens. So if you sit down, Hannah, with your notebook and imagine yourself as a consumer, an owner, an employee, a citizen, what are the top things within those 4 roles that I would like to do. That brings it more from the intrinsic motivation side rather than getting some kind of list from above, hey, you have to do all those things. So hopefully that's a little bit inspiring. So what are you going to do, Hannah?
I'm going to call Fidelity about my 401k. I already know what I'm going to do. No, but I think those are some great examples. And I know that, you know, it can be overwhelming to give a list of 10 things, but, you know, I think that just having some idea of what we can control, because sometimes it does feel so overwhelming and like we can't control it. And we're all just like escalating towards impending doom.
Yeah.
But, you know, if everybody works together, I'm sure that we can create solutions for the situation we're in. Anyway, speaking of people who are involved and interested in this topic, we have a ton of questions now. So
fantastic. Yeah.
So the first is more of a comment. Congrats for the sophisticated vision and the clear explanation. So thank you for that. And then we have a question about government infrastructure programs. So here's the question. Do you see large-scale government infrastructure programs, such as the proposed Green New Deal in the USA, as a compatible or even necessary component of your vision for market-driven, healthy green growth?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony, for that question. And the short answer is yes. It is a requirement. It's not just compatible. You see, markets may move in this direction by themselves, but what we've seen over the last couple of decades is that this movement towards more resource productivity, less waste, goes too slowly. And it also goes too slowly in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. So when I've been analyzing the data on this, we've seen typically, let's say, simplify it to a 2% improvement in resource productivity every year since 1990 to about 2010. 2%. That's way too little. So we need to speed this up. And happily, the 7 drivers I mentioned, they will help to accelerate this. But without government really making sure that we are developing this quickly enough, we're not going to make it. So I really believe in markets. I think they're wonderful, creative, dynamic institutions that really make our societies unique and special. But markets by themselves have no guidance. They can perpetuate very destructive practices, and they don't have no idea of targets. So this Green Deal is a kind of push, and then we also need science-based targets that governments can put in place and say, this is where we have to be by 2030, and we'll monitor the rate of change. And this rate of change of 2% needs to go above 5% per year for us to be able to secure a safe operating space for Earth. And also, I think you will see increasingly destructive and more violent and polarized societies if we do not reduce inequality sufficiently quickly. That's why I'm very enthusiastic about the stimulus bill of $1.9 trillion. It will reduce inequality unprecedented across US history over the last 34 years. And then it needs to be followed up with a big climate plan that I know Biden is currently working on. And in order to achieve that target of net zero carbon emissions from the power sector by 2035. So we need both the stimulus and the target, both the stimulating government and the entrepreneurial government that I was speaking about. So thanks for that very good question, Anthony. And I hope if you have more questions, if I didn't answer properly, please push me further. What's next, Hannah?
All right, so this one's from Dawn. Any other free databases that you can find out I guess to help you find out the environmental impact of an investment other than fossilfreefunds.org? So there are any websites or databases or resources where you can figure out the environmental impact of an investment? I guess not even just the obvious green energy companies, but maybe other organizations as well.
I would invite you to explore the newly emerging ESG funds, and then have a look at, because there are a number of again, ESG is environment, social, and governance. They rely on an accounting system which is much broader than the conventional financial. They rely on something called GRI, or Global Reporting Initiatives. And in the US, there's also some standards from the SASB, the Sustainable Accountants. Now, if you look into then, let's say you take 5 to 10 ESG funds, then have a look, what are the companies that they have picked? Why do they pick them? So also there is a very famous list of the 100 most sustainable companies by Corporate Knights. It's a Canadian-based news organization, and each year they score and rank the 100 most sustainable companies. And all of those on that list are really leaders in the world. So they also make for good candidates. So I would, rather than going to some database to have everybody, I would try to dig in, because the challenge is right now that the standards aren't really standards. To put it this way, we have 500 years of financial accounting with, since the double entry method that was developed in Italy in the 14th century, and 1400s, has been implemented in all companies. And even by the Great Depression in the 1930s, there were no proper financial standards. We're very early still when it comes to sustainability and ESG reporting standards. So the leading standards are the GRI and also something called the CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project. But the CDP doesn't really put it into an investment perspective. So that's why I would invite you to have a look on the type of funds that come up at the top, and also the Corporate Knights approach, where they also weight different aspects of the sustainability accounting. So hopefully that was some ideas. Corporate Knights, and have a look at ESG funds, how they think.
Great, that's really helpful. So here's another question. How important do you think EU taxonomy will be? And do you think others will follow suit?
Yes, I think the EU taxonomy is a major new development. And the reason why it is that, financial markets are global. There is tons of money traveling across the oceans every night, every day. So they're very much integrated. And when one big player, such as EU, starts to say, these are the criteria that marks investments and companies that will survive in a future low carbon EU or society, then that's a reduction of risk. And it has immediate and kind of self-reinforcing effects on the investment patterns. So as soon as one investor sees that, okay, my portfolio here is weak on this, not a lot of it, maybe just 20% of my current holdings will come in under the new criteria of the EU taxonomy, then they will start to shift their money. And when more and more investors do that, the value of these companies that match the criteria go up. And that starts a self-reinforcing circle, and more companies will want to be part of it. So yes, it does start in the EU, and yes, it's not completed quite yet. I mean, the law framework is there, but the technical details are still to be determined. So you see a lot of people already trying to kind of edge themselves into that corner where they will make sure they are part of it. So even before it's implemented, we see it having an effect. And then, of course, America is known for doing its own thing. So at some point, I'll expect American exceptionalism to want to have the US taxonomy. But that will only be after the financials are starting to suffer because you don't have a US taxonomy. How quickly that will take, I don't know, but give it 5 years, then I'm sure it's coming on. And if the government doesn't do it, then some other type of financial coalition will try to get it in place. So I think the EU taxonomy is a major thing, and it's not just for EU people, it's for the global financial market. So thanks for that question. Hopefully that was some, yeah.
I think you're optimistic that the US will have its own taxonomy instead of saying, we don't need to do that, we're in America, but it does happen. I'm hoping. All right, so here's another question. Do you see emission trading systems as a useful tool for the green transition? The EU has had an ETS since 2005. China will have one soon. USA, well, let's see. As I said, you never know what's going to happen, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, some states in the US have this. I'm sure you're aware of that, and particularly on the West Coast, so California and Oregon and etc., Washington. So China has also starting on it. And what we've seen in the EU, if that is a rule, is that it took much longer than most analysts anticipated. So the EU ETS started in 2005, and there was a lot of buzz, particularly leading up to the 2009 Copenhagen conference, which then crashed, and then came the the Great Recession, and suddenly there were loads of too much allowances and the carbon offsets available. So it really didn't work. Now, however, it's been kind of gradually being repaired and repaired and repaired. And this is the way government can work, which is very different the way businesses work. Government, the bureaucrats, they never give up if they have this right, shall we say, the right concept at the bottom. So now we've seen that finally, and a major reason for this is that the EU put in something called a deletion mechanism, so that you can delete excess allowances. And just the threat now of having this deletion or purging mechanism is enough to get the EU carbon allowance to surge. So now they're about 40 euros, or that's like $45 per the ton, and it's for the entire industrial sector in Europe. And when people see it going up, then they have to risk for it going even further up. So even if it's 45, now people are starting to plan that it may go to 80 or 100. And at that point, it becomes a really effective tool. So back in 5 years ago, when it was like 4 or 5 euros, it didn't make much of a dent at all. But now it's finally, after 15 years of regulatory struggle, coming in and hitting that at the exact time as the Green Deal and the EU taxonomy. So these things are in there for real, and I'm certain that this will have a huge impact on the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you for that.
And as for when USA will come, of course, I'm not an American. So what do you think, Hannah? When will the US carbon trading scheme come, if ever?
I don't know. There are too many plot twists and turns. I have no idea when that will happen. But all right, we have one more question. When alerting or voting for our politicians concerned with sustainability, should we choose politicians who have an understanding of the market-driven side of how to inspire large-scale change? It seems that the more progressive, far-left views business as in competition or antagonistic with progressive goals. I favor an all-hands-on-deck model. Anyway, I guess that kind of gets back to your thesis, if you will, about whether or not you're anti-growth or pro-growth, and where you can find the middle ground.
This is exactly the reason why I wrote this book. So it's a very good observation by the Anonymous. So, in my heart, I'm, if you will, quite far left, progressive. I really want to fight for inequality, climate justice, and a cleaner environment, and rein in the excesses of runaway capitalism. But from a kind of more pragmatic and more based on a theory of change, where you have to engage the mainstream, then I sometimes find the rhetoric of progressive forces, what you call the left-hand side, self-defeating. So unfortunately, I think they're often shooting themselves in the foot by forcing too much into a anti-growth, anti-market, anti-private, what's the right word, venture rhetoric. So you fall into this abyss of either anti-growth or pro-growth. And I had a student, and she helped me put this right. She called it the green squeeze, because I complained a few times about, when I'm among environmentalists, Coming from the business school, being an entrepreneur, speaking about funds and innovation and investments, I'm seen as way too market friendly, conservative, market freedom ideologue. So their eyes glaze over and they score. I see they kind of their jaws tighten when I speak about growth and GDP and innovation and all these things. But then so I'm thrown out among the deep greens, and then I go to the mainstream investors, and I've been a facilitator of strategy discussions and help them craft winning strategies and grow their market share and investments. And then when they hear me speak about market and the climate or inequality, oh, they see me as a really greeny, kind of far. I speak as if I was a green hipster, you know. So that's the green squeeze. When I'm among the Greens, I sound too economist, and that's an insult among them. And then when among the market players and the economists, I'm a green hipster, which is an insult too, I guess. So how do we build that bridge? And that's something I feel in my body. It's been like tough trying to go back and forth between these camps, and that's why I had to write Tomorrow's Economy, to make that bridge in a solid and realistic way.
Well, I'm glad you did. I have to say, though, I don't mind being a green hipster. So my family thinks I'm crazy because they're like, but how will we pay for it? But I'd rather be a green hipster these days. All right. So in your opinion, what do you hope or expect to come out of the COP26? A global carbon ETS market?
Okay, wow.
Something else?
Yeah, so explain everybody. The COP26, that is the conference of the parties in terms of the Paris Agreement rollout, and it's going to happen later this year in Glasgow, in Scotland. And every country is supposed to heighten their goals so that we together can move ahead towards achieving the Paris Agreement. So will there be a global carbon ETS market so that the carbon offsets can be traded globally? And I think the answer to that is no. I don't have any optimistic expectations for that because of a global carbon price would hit different markets very differently. So this is the difference between real purchasing power in a local currency, is sometimes called power purchasing parity. So $20 is nothing in the US. Well, of course it is, but you know, it's a huge sum if you live in Nepal, for instance. So having the same price in the same currency everywhere is clearly infeasible. So there will be regional ETS markets, and hopefully they start off as bubbles everywhere, and then they gradually kind of grow into larger and larger bubbles. But I expect that process to take a very long time before there's a global CO2 or global carbon market, if ever. And I'm not sure even if it's needed, because as these things develop and as renewables get cheaper and cheaper, the installation of those will be cheaper in low purchasing power markets as well. So the one unified global carbon price is unfortunately a kind of neoclassical fantasy of economists, and I don't think it's realistic. It belongs inside economic models, not inside the real messy world of politics, of which I am also a part.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing all your ideas with us and for spending your time with us today. This has been a great talk. And it's just great to chat with you.
Lovely talking with you as well, Hannah. You have so many good questions.
Yeah, everyone had a lot of great questions today. So we have some information in the chat so you can learn more about the book. And we also have some alternatives of where you can find books if the bookstore you want to go to is closed. And we also have a collection of all of our MIT Press Live events. We do this once a month now, and we keep videos for everyone. So if you want to find out more, we have a link for that as well. But definitely take a look at Tomorrow's Economy. It's available in most bookstores, and you can find more places to buy it on our website as well. All right. Thank you so much, Per.
Thank you, Hannah. I'll go back to Parliament and see if I can make a last statement for the day then.
Yes.
So bye-bye.
Bye. Talk to you
Good being with
later.
you.